Tonight, as you know, is the last, the name of the series is Hubris and Atonement, the State of Israel and the Jewish People, 1972-75. And tonight, as always, as I try to at the end, the perspective one, from then until now, how the events of 72-75 affect us today, and they do. And let me start, because we have a lot of ground to cover, and I have a limited amount of time. Yeah, here's my Ellis Island trip that's coming up on Pesach, second day of Chol HaMoed. A number of people have already signed up, and what do you call it? If you, well, listen, it sells itself. I mean, if you're interested in Ellis Island, the Statue of Liberty, you'll come. If you don't, you won't. I think it speaks for itself. Here, I hope, is my next, I'm pretty sure, well, this will be the next series I hope to do in the spring over here, and you'll be seeing more details about it, I guess, and where when in such place I'll send it out, because I'm more and more convinced that a lot of the current Jewish condition, the good and the bad, especially bad as a result of the French Revolution and the after. No, I mean, Joe and Lai, I'm sure many of you know, said very famously, it's too early to tell the effects of the French Revolution. In Jewish history, it's particularly true, because as I'll speak about, hope to today at the end of my talk, at the current time, the majority of Jewish people, I'm sorry to say, in an advanced state of disintegration. Don't really think a little bubble called Baltimore, It's not like that out everywhere. And it traces back to the French Revolution, okay? So anyway, you'll leave it for that. But let me plunge, that takes care of everything, right? Now we can get right into it, am I right? Let's go to the next one. Yeah, exactly. The Yom Kippur War, here I go. The Yom Kippur War was the last state-to-state war. Israel has not had any wars since 1973. That's interesting. Not against Egypt, not against Syria, not against Jordan. I mean, an old-fashioned war like that in 48, and like that in 67, and like that in 73, army to army. And so Israel has been secure from a certain point of view for the last 45 years from that kind of a threat, which is significant. As I said, history is about the past always changing. You're always looking at a different perspective as time passes by. You're supposed to anyway. And, or was there not a song called Sunrise, Sunset? And, yes, I knew there was. And anyhow, you look back, you say that was the last war, okay? Now I might be wrong. Assad and Saddam Hussein in the 80s and 90s did have as their objective the building up of their own strength so they could have another conventional war. They knew they're not ready for it yet. Saddam Hussein was ready to go. That's for a future, but he was ready to go. The Iraqi army was big. I might remind you, if I need to, that the Iraqi army had a big war head-to-head against Iran in the 80s, remember? And that was army to army, and it was a biggie, and therefore he was ready to take on Israel at the time of 1991 Gulf War. But it didn't happen. So in spite of what I just said, the fact is that there hasn't been a conventional war of the regular type since the Yom Kippur War. Because without Egypt, there's no realistic military option. With our perspective today, the Yom Kippur War helped propel the series of events that led to the peace treaty with Egypt. And once Egypt, for which Israel paid a price. And once Egypt is out of the military equation, for whatever reason, you can't put together a realistic thing to take on the Israeli army. Jordan can't do it. Lebanon can't do it. Syria strove to, but couldn't do it under Assad Sr. And Iraq was kind of far away. So, but on the other hand, I'm only speaking about symmetrical warfare. Okay? And this is a big difference as we see tonight in the perspective of 45 years. Let's go to the next one. Yeah, people like this, General Tal, who was tank to tank. That's old-fashioned regular war, okay? Like World War II, that sort of thing. And that's what Israel had, of course, in 67, and to a degree in 56, and certainly in 73. It was tank battles. So Israel has the best tank force, and there hasn't been a tank battle of that type. No, it was old-fashioned kind of symmetrical warfare where I got an army, you got an army, and we do it that way. But the Israeli army, I don't even know about today, but certainly after 73 for a long time, was not really organized for what they call asymmetrical warfare. The Ben Gurion army, which is the old classic Israeli army, was created for symmetrical warfare, okay? Ben Gurion, under his time, and Dayan and all those guys built up the Shiryon, the Air Force, the infantry, the mechanized divisions. That's the kind, in other words, for a replay of a certain type of World War II, okay? And that's the kind of war people knew in the 20th century. And because of that, Israel's always had a problem dealing with asymmetrical problems all the way back in Ben Gurion's time. Because with the old crazy borders, remember the Arabs used to raid all the time in Israel, and all Israel could do would go back to the next one and do like the Kibbutz massacre, where they just wiped out a whole Arab village in 1953 and brought the whole UN and Eisenhower and the whole world down upon their head. And it didn't really solve anything, except in the sense that if you punch them hard enough, they won't come back again. But it's not true, because the nature of the Arab dynamic, especially with the old borders, they're just going to cross the borders here and then try to do mayhem whenever they can. And so it was a classic case of a symmetrical response to an asymmetrical challenge. And that's something the United States has had trouble with. All kind of countries have had trouble with this. A few countries have had experience, usually the imperial ones like England, have had experience with creating like asymmetrical forces to deal with asymmetrical threats. Frankly, it's a big problem we had in Vietnam, isn't it? You know, they could come in and do this, and all we come back and bomb and wipe out a whole village. I mean, we remember this. It was, that was the misfighting of the Vietnam War, which was such a mess. And it's throughout history. This is a classic of history. Up until and after the Yom Kippur War, the Israeli army would continue to have issues with asymmetrical conflict situations, where the besting of an enemy army on the battlefield by no means assures final victory in the war. The classic example of that is, of course, Napoleon in Russia, where he beat the Russians in battles, okay? I mean, beat them bad in battles. Here's the French army, the best, and at its peak in 1812, 500,000, with the contingents from all other captive nations in Europe. This is from the Russian movie War and Peace. They came in and they did all the military things right. And to put it in simple terms, Napoleon got to Moscow. You know, Hitler never got to Moscow. Napoleon got to Moscow, agreed? So he did all the stuff you're supposed to do. And he beat the army and he took their enemy capital and so on and so forth. The Russians don't surrender. What are you going to do? You say, what are you going to do when the other side doesn't surrender? I've told you about that before. What do you do? And to my knowledge, nobody has surrendered since 1945. I can't think of a case. You know, when MacArthur took the surrender on the battlefield in Missouri in Tokyo Bay, that was the last time I know. There was no surrender in the Korea War or any of those other kind of wars. And what do you do when the other guy doesn't surrender? It's taka bummer, you know? The result, what was the result? By the way, so what was the result? The Russian army froze to death, as we all know, in the winter, right? The Russians said, we're not surrendering, we're staying here. And after a while, Napoleon had no supplies, he had to go back, and the army got wiped out on the go back. This is a classic, as you know. What does that mean? He was ready for a army-to-army war. He knew how to do that. He did not know how to do an army-to-war. Like, what is that? What do you do? You can't kill everybody in Russia. You know, like, what do you do? How do you secure victory? I'm simply showing this as a very dramatic and well-known example of what I'm talking about over here, which the United States of America faces today in its conflicts in places like Afghanistan and elsewhere, which is how you define victory. You understand? You go, you shoot up, you kill, this and that and the other. You have what they used to call in Vietnam the body counts, remember that? And all the rest. And then what? You understand? And then what? Well, what do you do? And so the next wars that Israel got involved with after the Yom Kippur War, now that we know this from the past, involved Lebanon, which was a quagmire, was it not? Okay, when Israel went in 82, the IDF could win any set-piece battle with an enemy force. So any time in 82, for example, they actually went up against an enemy concentrated force, so that Tzahal knew what to do, and they beat them, but they couldn't destroy the enemy because the PLO just simply faded away. You know who did this? George Washington. That's how he won the Revolutionary War. Agreed? The British beat him over and over again. It's well known. British beat him over and over again. But all he had to do was make sure he didn't surrender and keep the army in place until the proper opportunity. The French came in and this and that and the other, and by the time Yorktown was over, he won. Because all you have to do is win the last battle, you see? And these are classic examples from history of what you call symmetrical responses to asymmetrical situations. And this is well known. We even have terminology for it. And this is a problem for Israel, because what happened with Lebanon, it turned out, as we all know, to be the Vietnam for Israel. It cost Israel a fortune, because wars do. It cost casualties without the prospect of victory and without the prospect of an end to further casualties, which dangerously saps public morale, particularly in a democracy, in Israel's democracy, although we learned, to our surprise, that the Soviet Union couldn't handle the body bags coming back from Afghanistan. That bothered people, and it bothered the regime. It involved Arab civilian casualties in this case, Arab ones, as every war in the world does, It damages Israel politically, including its ties with America. You know, the Lebanon business led to strained relations later even with Ronald Reagan, who was very pro-Israel, okay? And it brought Israel and America to the brink. It did not destroy the Palestinian enemy, hence military conflict for Israel comes to be, and eventually comes to be clearly seen as what I would call counter-Clausewitzian, right? Because Clausewitz very famously defined war as pursuit of politics by other means and the objective to destroy the enemy. Or I said that wrong. That's actually wrong what I said. The objective is to get the enemy to do what you want. Right? Clausewitz gave a lot of thought to what is war. What's shot war? Right? What's the point? Are you just letting off stomp violence? That's pointless. That's dumb. Right? War has to have a goal. By the way, not everybody gets this. Many wars aren't fought this way. But Clausewitz, who wrote about war back in the 19th century, said that war has to have a purpose. And the purpose is, as I said before, either the destruction of the enemy or getting the enemy to do what you want, which we call surrender. That works too. We didn't have to wipe out Japan. We just got them to do what we want. And by the way, then we help them. But the point is you do. Israel could not do that, proved it could not do that in the Lebanon fighting and the other kind of fightings over there. And this was very problematic. So this is something that we see with the perspective of 45 years, I would say today, that the last conventional regular war was the Yom Kippur War, which Israel at least knew how to fight. They got caught by surprise with their pants down. But they knew how to fight that sort of thing. You had an Egyptian army coming at you with tanks and planes and armored stuff and so forth. And commando groups even. And same thing with Syria. But what do you do when it's not like that? You get it? What do? You can't send in tanks to catch two terrorists blowing up a building. What exactly do you do? Now, another blatant fact that jumps out at us, as far as Israel's situation is concerned, in the perspective of 45 years, has to do with Iran. In the Yom Kippur War, we didn't have no Iran. It was still the Shah, correct? And that means, not that he was a tzaddik, but Israel was not in their gun sights. Okay? Iran was not an enemy and a sworn enemy, a very dangerous enemy of Israel at that time. And that had a huge impact on the balance of power situation. After the Yom Kippur War, Israel did not have to deal with hostile Iran with A-bombs and all the rest of it, which is a factor of supreme importance in retrospect. You see, after the Khomeini Revolution of 1979, that's 40 years now. It's 2018, it's 39 years. Iran would become a terrible nemesis for Israel. Over the next 40, I don't know why people, not that I'm so sorry, I saw it at that time. One of the, the Khomeini Revolution has a number of goals. This. One of them is to wipe out Israel. It's not the only one, but it's an important one. They're among their top 10, and they take it very seriously. That's very bad. After the Khomeini Revolution, or over the next 40 years, Iran would be particularly active in Lebanon, invigorating a Shiite militancy in southern Lebanon, building up an army of God, what they call the Hezbollah, creating terror networks of remarkable complexity and lethality. Remember they blew up the Marines? That's who did it. Okay? And whatever happened to them. Now, prior to 1979, back in the good old regular 70s, the Shiites in southern Lebanon had been historically quiescent. The Lebanon border was always the one border, especially before the 73 war, or let's put it this way, before the 67 war, where there was no trouble. There was no terrorists coming over. The Lebanese prevented the terrorists from coming into Israel. I'm talking about in the good old days, right? Look at the border that Israel had to set up of it. It used to be what you call over there the security zone, was mainly a Shiite minority territory. Lebanon has the Sunnis and the Christians and the Maronites and the Shiites and the Shiites were a minority within Lebanon, and they were not anti-Israel. They're not Palestinian. they never caused any trouble. But after 1979, they sure as heck do, until they got the situation they have today, which is unbelievably bad. As I said, after 1979, Israel being their gun sights of an increasingly powerful Iran, which has the advantage of being far away from Israel, but possesses bases on Israel's border. Okay? So as you see, Iran is far away from Israel, but look over there on the right. They're close to us. We're not close to them. That's bad. They have the whole Hezbollah junk set up on Israel's borders, literally. We don't have anything on Iran's borders. So they got a perfect situation. It's very bad. Curiously, over the course of the last 40 years, the USA will not move against Iran, right? Despite the USA being in Iran's gun sights. Again, one of their goals, whether people want to admit it or not, is to take down the USA. In Israel, they want to wipe out. America, I don't know what they plan to do, but they plan to take it down in one form or another. They said it. And so here you have a country that's out to get America, and the U.S. hasn't directly responded to this. Not Carter, or Reagan, or Bush, or Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama, not that I know of. Every administration that came in office came in trying to play around footsie with Iran and began by sending them secret peace feelers, none of which actually worked out. Every president, including Reagan. At the beginning of it, they sending people secretly, Iran, let's cut a deal, and all the rest of it. And it's, the result has been a failure, and the buildup of Iran progressively over 40 years. Remember, the 2003 George Bush Jr. war in Iraq was actually good for Iran, correct? It eliminated the Iraqi problem on their borders, right? See, there's Iraq on the left, obviously. Oh, I have one of these, let's see. Here's Iraq, here's Iran. They had a big war in the 80s, and then America destroyed them in the 2003, and all of a sudden they said, it's a happy hunting ground for Iran, because they can then, as you know, encourage the Shiites over here to bomb the Americans, with the hope it gets incredibly complex, but with the hope that the Shiites will one day want to be part of Iran. It turns out the Shiites do not want to be part of Iran, but that's good too, and then they're at the border in between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It gets interesting, as you know. So don't ever be impressed by superficial media headlines. You got to know this kind of junk. Now, my point, of course, is that the emergence of a growing and implacable Iran is, in my opinion, the biggest problem for Israel to emerge after the Yom Kippur War. Not Arafat, not Russia, not Syria, Iran. And you can't do nothing about it, or Israel hasn't been able to do nothing about it. What are you going to do? You can't fly the whole Israeli army, across the Middle East to go invade Iran. What are you going to do? So how's that work? Now, I was saying this 25 years ago, frankly, but today it's a commonplace. Today, as you know, Israel's kissing up with the Saudi Arabians, all the others, based on the principle, the enemy of my man is my friend. Why do you find secretly, that the Saudis and the Qataris and all those other junk are cutting deals with Israel, and you see they're making bar mitzvahs over there, and they're going to have a liquid kollel soon in Abu Dhabi or something, Well, what's the reason? My enemy is my friend. You get it? Which, by the way, is no basis for an alliance. Don't fool yourselves. I heard of a guy named Roosevelt and Stalin. Maybe you heard of them also, right? These are alliances of convenience. They melt like the snowflakes. Okay. Now, President Obama's policy was to avoid conflict with Iran, which, of course, as we know, bothered Israel, which is Iran's declared target. So that's very recent. Okay. Here, take a look at this. Can we go back?
Prime Minister of Israel.
Can we start again?
I think he's made that very clear.
It's a short piece.
There's politics and political pressure inside of the United States. We all know that. The Prime Minister of Israel is deeply opposed to it. I think he's made that very clear. I have repeatedly asked, what is the alternative that you present that you think makes it less likely for Iran to get a nuclear weapon? And I have yet to obtain a good answer on that.
okay. You get my point. In other words, Obama's saying, so what do we do? Go to war? I mean, what's the solution? Which in other words, saying there is no solution, which is kind of interesting coming from the President of the United States. And now with Trump, fair vase, okay? It could go anywhere, right? The fact is, this Iran problem presents Israel in the 21st century. We're not in the Yom Kippur War anymore. In the 21st century, with a threat that did not exist in the 20th century. Israel today has to do, you got a Hezbollah, I think you know this, on the borders of Israel, something like 500,000 rockets and missiles. That's a lot where I come from, which will cause Israel very heavy physical damage, which was not the case in the Yom Kippur War, when Israel's interior was basically untouched. The bloody battles that we talked about this year that took place in the Milchemet Yom Kippurim took place in the Suez Canal area. You didn't want to be there, but they're in the Suez Canal area and on the Golan Heights. As a matter of fact, the Israeli boys that gave up their lives, that the Grillis were honoring over here, did so precisely for that reason, didn't they? They said, we got to stop these guys so they couldn't get into Israel proper. But the last time they had that Lebanon war was in 2006 or something like that. The whole Golan, the whole Galil got covered with bombs and rockets everywhere. Like it was like a shakeout, like what is going on over here? And now it's only worse in terms of quantity as well as quality. And what is the antidote to that? And there is none, at least not as far as I know. Now I wish they could erect, one of these electronic walls that blocks it. Now we got 500,000 of them. That's the Russian style. Just throw so many that the enemy's defense system just gets overwhelmed. Where in Russia they call it quantity becomes quality. And the Egyptians used this, for example, in the 73 war, as we spoke about. You had so many that it overwhelmed. And so, yes, we won the Yom Kippur War, but now the situation is more serious. And by the way, I'm not talking about the Palestinians. I'm not talking about the Hamas. I'm talking about the Lebanese Shiites who basically ought to have no trouble with Israel. Israel doesn't want to take over southern Lebanon. They don't want to. Particularly after Israel totally withdrew from South Lebanon in 2000. If you remember, Ehud Barak, when he was the prime minister for a short time, so one of the things he did, he said, we pulled out of every inch, even though they're still arguing about an inch or two, literally an inch or two, but nevertheless, Israel's out of there. And so, the Palestinians, I get it, but the Lebanese Shiites, what's that all about? I told you, when Khomeini made that revolution, one of the top items of their agenda as part of their Shiite ideology is to get Israel. It doesn't correspond to typical Western definitions of national needs. In typical definitions of Western needs, you say like this country is it a threat to me? They're going to wipe me out, so I got to do something. I'll give you an example. America and China, America and Russia, it's an objective threat. What does Iran have to fear from Israel? But that's because Western analyses do not take into account religious worldviews. And as we all know, religious people can be very nuts. And this is an example of it. Now, not in Baltimore, of course. Now, another effect of the Yom Kippur War, looking back now, was economic, the impact on Israel's economy. The war wrecked the economy of Israel. Whatever plans they had, and they had plans, we've discussed this in the past. The old Mapai system did have some kind of a plan which basically hoped that increasing productivity would one day overtake the super increasing consumer spending. You understand? Basically, if you produce enough that you can export it, then let's say, for example, you export 1 billion and then you import 1 billion in your consumer goods, so you're okay. But what, of course, was happening even before the Yom Kippur War was you're producing 500 million, you're exporting, you're producing and exporting 500 million, you're buying 2 billion and then 3 billion and 4 billion, and the war just aggravated that, did it not? In other words, let's put it this way, wars are very expensive. Israel at that time couldn't afford a war. And wars cost a fortune. Let me put it this way. As far as I'm aware, the United States financially has not recovered from the Vietnam War of LBJ, if you look at the history, and from the Bush War. I'm talking about in terms of money. Nobody's raising big taxes to balance this country's, pay the 20 trillion. I don't see that happening. And so, what are you going to do? Cut Social Security? Like, what's happening? This is a giant existential conundrum the United States has faced in our entire lifetime. we're not back in the time of Calvin Coolidge or anything like that. We're just cut everything. So what is the solution? And today's 20 trillion, it really is, as you know. And tomorrow it's 30 trillion. And then it's 40 trillion. And where does that go? Okay? Where does that go? Now, on the other hand, I always say like this: if there ever is a precedent to declare Chapter 11, it's Trump. Let's put it this way: he's got a record, But like I'll say, sue me, But that could be his farewell address. But we're just kidding. But barring something like that, what is the solution? What's the solution? The only guy I know who did it right financially when it comes to war was Bush Sr. Okay, because he got the Japanese and the Germans and these others, if you remember, to pay for the war. It cost like $70 billion, if I remember correctly, and because of various, that was James Baker and all the heavy diplomacy going at that time, he got the money from the Saudis and the others. They paid for the war. So all right, but Israel didn't have somebody to go pay for the war. It took Israel 20 years to pull out of the Yom Kippur War economic recession. Right? Productivity suffered. Wages increased crazily because the unions are very strong. And you had therefore rampant inflation because in order to do it, the government had to print money. And the rampant inflation, I think many of us are old enough to remember, was a defining feature of Israel once Begin came in the late 70s, the 80s, and early 90s. Or to be very exact, for 10 years, from 77 to like 86, when Shimon Peres became the finance minister. And thanks to George Shultz, who had been the U.S. Treasury Secretary before he was the Secretary of State, and he was a big friend of Israel. So they helped him deal with the crazy inflation. But for years, it was nuts in Israel. You remember that? Israel was up there with Argentina as the highest inflation. That's a bad sign of your economic health. That's due to the unforeseen Yom Kippur War, which Israel wasn't planning on, but they had to pay for anyway. And they couldn't do, countries can't do today anymore Adam Smith. You understand? Once upon a time you had the Adam Smith situation, which you say if you got too much of this, you cut here, you do this, you can't do that anymore. Like I say in America, you can't cut the unemployment insurance, you can't cut the Medicare, you can't cut the Social Security. It's not going to happen. And so what do you do? What do you do to balance your budget or to get some kind of financial way out? If somebody has a crystal ball, step forward, So Israel really took this real hard. As you see on the sun, Rabin, in the 3 years that he was in there, that's 74, 75, 76, into the beginning of 77, battled the inflation. I remember that. Yeshua Rabinowitz was his minister of finance, and they tried to cut, and they tried to do this. They didn't do a great job, but they did some kind of a job. Begin didn't even try it. Begin just indexed the darn thing. And, every time the value of the money went down 5%, they just jacked up the wages of everybody in Israel by 5%. Which is, a recipe for economic disaster. But that's what Israel ended up doing. So the Yom Kippur War had a powerful impact negatively on Israel's economy. And nothing pulled it out until the early 90s when they switched to the beginning of capitalism, to use modern terminology. Some kind of capitalism in the sense of the government selling off the government-owned industries and, more in a private enterprise. But Israel today, even with the better economy, still can't make ends meet and still can't deal, because no modern industrial Western country can deal with what I call the large social budget on the one hand, which will never be enough to handle all the problems, and at the same time maintain a strong military. I mean, how do you do that? You got to be Santa Claus. I mean, how do you do that? And so, aggravate matters. Israel was spooked by the Yom Kippur War. I don't blame him. And Shimon Peres was the defense minister after the Yom Kippur War, and he was very good. And on the other hand, what did they do? They said we made a lot of mistakes. One of the mistakes we had was we allowed ourselves into a crazy self-delusion that 10 Israeli tanks can take on 100 Syrian tanks. 10 tanks cannot take on 100 tanks. You get it? This was the trouble in 73. That Israel continuously found itself outgunned, outnumbered, out-ammunitioned, and why do you have to fight under such circumstances? I mean, what they asked from the GIs was terrible. You understand? Because you're always totally outnumbered. It so happened that in 67, since Israel hit them first, then they could, decide where to hit, so then a smaller force could take out a larger force. But not when you have a regular war like you had in 73, where they hit us first. And so Israel's response was to dramatically expand the quantity of the Israeli army. You understand? Physically, they added more divisions and brigades and larger tank formations and, things like that. That costs a lot of money where I come from. I didn't get it from Sunday surplus. So where do you get all the new stuff? You understand? And Israel felt, and I do get it, Israel felt this is absolutely necessary. I don't remember the numbers, but they went like from 8 brigades to 15 or, some crazy expansion like that. Which, same thing happened in the United States, if you know your American history. When Truman was in office after the Second World War, he cut the army to the bone. After the Second World War, it was a criminal. He made the entire military, he did it like they do in Missouri. He said, here's the budget, now you guys play within it, So the whole U.S. budget, I remember this, in 49 and 50 was $13 billion. That's the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. $13 billion. And when the admirals protested, he fired them. It's a whole ganze Geschichte. You can look it up if you're interested. Okay, and then what happened? We got the Korean War, and we got caught with our pants down, and we had no soldiers, and we had no nothing, and the Army went crazy and just did a tremendous expansion in late 50 and 51 and 52, and then you end up spending all the money. So Israel had to do that, or felt they had to do that in response to the 73 war, because they didn't know what you and I know today. How could they? Which is there's not going to be another war. They said Saddam might hit us again a year from now or 2 years. I get that. I mean, that's a reasonable suspicion. And in order to be ready for the next war and not get hurt like we did in the last war, we have to have double the number of tanks, double the number of missiles, and all the rest of it. So you have a crashing economy, and you got to dramatically expand your defense budget. So you tell me what that means. This is the way it went. And it turned out, as I say before, that these economic pressures coexisted with a spiraling consumerism and wrecked the socialist economy. This is now what Golda Meir had in mind when she fought the Yom Kippur War. This war is going to take socialism down. But it did. Because the socialist economy in Israel meant that the government owns the large companies and corporations, and the government makes the plans for their economic, outplanning and development and so forth, projects, and they do so according to a certain model. And here came the Yom Kippur War and just busted all that. The budgets aren't there, the requirements are different. A socialist government-run economy usually too rigid to respond to market forces, and that's what happened in Israel. And so this was the beginning of the end of the old Mapai economy. You can say that's a good thing, you can say it's a bad thing. There are arguments on both sides. If you're a person who was paying a nickel for bread, you thought it was a good thing. You understand? I mean, there's different sides to this. But overall, it really messed up Israel's economy. The expanded IDF turned out not to be good for asymmetrical wars, as 1982 demonstrated. They built up this giant army under Rabin and Begin, and then they used it in the Lebanon invasion. It didn't work. Like I say, if they would have faced the Syrian army, that's one thing. But they didn't. They faced all this PLO business where they're running in and out and back and forth, and it didn't turn out well. The Yom Kippur War damaged Israel's self-esteem. That's very interesting. Israel has always been famous, I'm sorry to say, for boasting and bragging. It's not good. Maybe that's how you have to be in the Middle East. I don't know. If this would have resulted in a more modest discourse internally and externally, that would have been a good thing. If after the Yom Kippur War, Israel and its leaders and military leaders would have adopted what Chaim Herzog was calling for in his famous book, very thoughtful book, and it came out a year after the Yom Kippur War. It's as interesting as a timepiece. And Chaim Herzog was Israel's #1 military commentator. It's actually quite a good book. I mean, it's out of date, so to speak, but it's a very good book. And he said at that time, he said, we went into the war with too much hubris. That's why I called this year the hubris. And we went in this war with too much self-congratulation and all the rest of it. We should replace this by a more sober discourse, a better way of talking. But it's not true. It doesn't work. It's not part of the Israeli psyche. I read the other day, some Israeli general, some idiot said, comes the next war with Hezbollah, we're going to wipe him out, we're going to kill Nasrallah, we're going to take him down, all the rest of it. What is that, What are you talking for? Lishbor tatzamot, as they say, we're going to break their bones. Shut up. You understand? Do it, if it comes to that, but shut up. It's not. It makes you look stupid. You understand? But it's like I said before. It's part of the water you drink in the Middle East. The Arabs talk like that. The Israelis talk that. It's a bad thing we picked up from them. It's a bad thing we picked up from them. That's not how the Israeli psyche is built. They got to boast. What about the Arabs? What has been the long-term impact of the Yom Kippur War? What was the long-term impact of the oil price bonanza, which emerged as a result of the Yom Kippur War? Now that we're looking back at close to half a century, negative and negative, I'm happy to say. Well, not really. It's unfortunate for the West. Since the economies and the politics didn't work out in the Middle East, they all moved to Europe, right? As we get your large Islamic populations in places like France and Belgium and Holland and all the rest of it, because it's dysfunctional back at home, even though they got all the money. Because, as I think I mentioned here a couple weeks ago, the wealth that comes in was not and is not properly distributed. So will not trigger in the half century after the Yom Kippur War, after they get the oil bonanza, it will not trigger a great Arab leap forward, as Mao Zedong used to talk about, right? In which they become the next United States, which would have been good if you follow what I'm saying. Good in what sense? So then the Arabs would stay there, they concentrate on building their own economy. That's okay. If you don't bother me, I have nothing against you. You know? Let the Saudi Arabians have a shopping center and the best mall in the world, and who cares? You know, I got no problem with that, do you? Okay, just leave me alone. That's all. But it didn't work out like that. Instead, the money for the shopping center ended up in somebody's bank account. What else to do? I think Arafat died as the richest guy in the world, or one of the 5 or 6 richest guys in the world, and they never will find the money, will they? They never will find the money. You know, that's what happens with these people. I still remember, I'm old enough to remember when Imelda Marcos died, right? That's right. And some comedian said like this, he says, on a dying bed, a husband said like this, where'd you put the keys to the Swiss bank account? In my shoes. You know, right. So that's how it works. That's how it works in these countries. You give them all this development money, or in this case, the oil money, and what happens to it? It never gets where it should get. You see? And so the result is you still have a poor society, just with fancier public buildings and nicer roads. You know, you get it? You know, you have nicer public buildings and bigger roads and a cool beach and increased tourism, but doesn't hit the person that's supposed to hit. And this has been a huge business. As with the Shah, as I explained last week, a sudden flow of cash is not of use if you don't have the infrastructure to use it properly. It's one of the great lessons of our, actually it's in Koheles, but it's one of the great lessons of our time. Getting a lot of money in and of itself doesn't help if you don't know what to do with the money. Right? If you're a big ball player, you have no education, you have a 4th grade education, you make $20 million a year, it's not much use to you. As experience shows, within a short time you don't have the money. Instead you have a lot of tsaras. That's counterintuitive. It should be, you get a lot of money, right? You've won the golden calf, and it hasn't turned out that way. And it seems that freedom is an important component of a proper infrastructure for how to use money properly. But if there is no democratic legitimacy to or in the Arab state system, that has not changed in 45 years. I'll say it again. All the different Arab countries have essentially the same kind of political system they had back then, even though they have a ton more money. And because they have this non-democratic, that's an understatement, world in which the masses are treated, maybe properly so, as some have to be policed and scared all the time. So that works if the goal of the system is to maintain stability, and if the maintenance of stability is to keep the same people in power all the time. Right? That works if that's your goal. Like Shlomo Melech said, what's the goal? But if the goal is to transform the society to make it more like a prosperous society and an educated society and an enlightened, shall we say, society, and hopefully then a more normal and tolerant society, then you need your freedom. Now, this is a great issue of the 21st century. Countries like China, for example, and elsewhere, can they make money without the freedom? This is and the jury's not out on that yet at all. Okay, we don't know. The dictatorships, and there are many of them, have been making the case for 1,000 years that the two are not necessary with each other. You can have a clever dictatorship of one form or another, like Putin, for example, that can provide an increase in the standard of living, to use the expression, and the modern technological society with all it has to offer. Can you? That's the question. Can you? Well, it's going to see, but it hasn't played out in the Arab world. And so, because the oil money will not be of practical use to the big states that need it, because the big states don't have the oil. Syria and Egypt, with the big population, have no oil. Not in the 70s, not today, a little bit. The main result will be Sadat's embrace of Kissinger and the USA. That is the reason. Egypt switched after the Yom Kippur War. We saw the beginning of the process to orient itself to get along with first Kissinger, and then afterwards Carter, and then the others. And they did it for one big reason, because Egypt did not become an American-type democracy. They did not really get rid of the secret police state. They did not embrace, nor do they today, the values of tolerance and multi-ethnic, multiculturalism, and all that kind of business. You get none of that. If you don't believe me, watch Memory for 5 minutes. Okay, just look at an interview in any Egyptian TV show. They're not into that. Yeah, the reason Sadat and his successors, which is the largest Arab country, will go American, as the expression goes, will be because of the dysfunctional economic situation. That's the only reason. Okay, Israel. Look at this. Look at the numbers. Look at the numbers. They tripled the population since the Yom Kippur War. They used to have 38 million, now they got 100 million. This is a little old, Actually, that's from 2016. They got 100 million. So, wait a minute. I'm not an economist, but you don't have to be a genius to figure out like this. If you've got a tripling population, you better triple the economy. Agreed? Agreed? If you can't triple the economy, what do you have? You have what you call negative economic growth. You follow? And that's what's happened with Egypt and Syria and all these other countries. They have negative economic growth, meaning the economy is too small to provide jobs, schools, and all the rest, food eventually, for increasing numbers. And by the way, it's out of control. Tomorrow it's going to be 110 million, 120 million, 130 million, 140 million. It really is. So we're going to provide the food for that, let alone the shoes. But where are you going to provide the food? This is what I mean when I say Egypt has been having, since long before the Yom Kippur War, but certainly since the Yom Kippur War, a dysfunctional economic situation to which they can only apply Band-Aids. They've been very good at that. The regime has been good with Band-Aids for quite a while now, so 45 years. But that's all they are. Don't fool yourselves. How do you, if you're Sadat or afterwards Mubarak, who was in there until very recently, how do you supply what the people need? Where are your jobs? Right? Where are your industries that can provide employment? And I'll tell you, in the case of Egypt, it's actually funny. This was a clever thing on the part of Nasser, and I'll tell you what I mean. Who makes revolutions? The answer is not the peasants, and not the uneducated guys, and not the guy with the small grocery store. There ain't no revolutions. It's always alienated, educated members of the elite. I'll give you an example. Lenin, Mao, Ho Chi Minh, people like that. They're members of elite. That is, they have education. They have education. They don't like the system for one reason or another. The system not been good to them. And therefore, they use all their cochos to replace the system with another one, usually involving the death of tens of millions of people. That is what they call in the history books the 20th century. Now, wait a minute. In Egypt, in 1952, 53, when they launched the current regime, because the current regime in Egypt has been in power for about 60 years now, since 1952. So they made a law early on, everybody with a college degree, first of all, education is free, and everybody with a college degree is guaranteed a government job if you can't get one in the private sector. So then you shut up because you get your paycheck. You understand? You don't want to do anything, lose your paycheck. So how do you support a system like that? That's why I'm trying to give you an understanding of the dynamics that lay behind what eventually become the Arab-Israel or the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. Now the answer, of course, is the Band-Aid. What do they call the Band-Aid in English? Uncle Sam. All right? But how long? How long? As a Band-Aid. How long? Nasser had industrialized Egypt starting in the 50s, 60s, but in a socialist way, and socialist government-run enterprises cannot compete in the international economy. Does that make sense? It used to be, in the Adam Smith system, you had to compete in the local economy. So maybe socialist countries made it that you don't have to compete at the local economy because the government controls everything. But there's still the big world out there, and nobody controls that. And so if Egypt will produce cars, but the cars are more expensive than elsewhere or not as good, they're not going to sell any. So what do you do with that factory that employs 10 or 20,000 people? This is a problem around the world, but I'm talking now happens to be about Egypt. You have fake industrialization. We talked today about fake news. You have fake industrialization because you have the physical forms of it, but it's not really competing in the market, which was an industry is supposed to be able to do. Now, the Egyptians are not dumb people, not at all. Not at all. Egyptian students, I bet you some of you have interacted with them, and I've had in college myself some Egyptian students, are very bright and very capable people. It's not a dumb group, but an authoritarian culture is incompatible with a startup economy. Because a startup economy, as we call it today, requires a certain irreverence, I would call it. Would you agree with that? A certain irreverence. Think of the people that created the internet. You understand? So it turns out Adam Smith is a social revolutionary. You understand? In other words, a pure capitalism means that you're prepared to let a lot of forms go by the wayside if they can't make it in that jungle of economic competition. And the Arabs in general, and the Egyptians in particular, certainly went down like that. The Arabic culture, the Egyptian culture, they complain about it themselves, is authoritarian, which means the main way of getting ahead is kissing up to the people above you. That's not the irreverence that you need to create Facebook, so to speak, right? That's not the irreverence you need to create a Bill Gates situation. You understand? You need people a little quirky, a little nuts. And it's not going to be rewarded in your social culture. It's not going to happen. Furthermore, they need a birth control, but that would offend Islamism, which is Egypt's biggest stability threat. They're tripling the population, I just showed you. That's a disaster unless you have a way of dealing with it. And if you don't have a way of dealing with it, maybe you want to tamp that down. Can't do it in Egypt, can't do it in the Middle East. You understand? It'll go against the teachings of Islam, and the regime has enough trouble riding that particular wave. Nasser and Sadat and Mubarak and Sisi have all tried to get some kind of birth control situation. Nasser even. You'd be surprised. He had an interview about this in 1963 with a journalist. The name of the journalist, Gore Vidal. Okay? And he said, I kid you not, he said, we're looking for a pasuk in the Quran that would justify this. We haven't found it. They recognized at that time, that's 60 years ago almost, they recognized at that time this is a giant threat to the stability, for the future of Egypt, but they had no answer to it. Egypt is Be'etzim, a very religious country. It's the home of the Muslim Brotherhood. That's where the Muslim Brotherhood started, in Egypt, Hassan al-Banna. The Muslim Brotherhood waged a war against Nasser. Nasser battled them with all the tools in a modern police state. So he killed them. Sadat, who came after him, resisted them, but much less strongly. So during his time in the 70s, they grew during his time in power, and eventually they killed him. Right? That's what happened. To the Muslim Brotherhood, the regime in Egypt, this is true. I'm telling you things that are true today. To the Muslim Brotherhood, the regime in Egypt, which is the regime of 1952, it was the one that brought Nasser to power, and then when he died, Sadat, when he died, it's Mubarak, and now with a little bit of a break, Sisi has picked up where Mubarak left off. To the Muslim Brotherhood, the regime is illegitimate, okay? This was hard to sell back in the time of the charismatic Nasser, because Nasser was able to, he had policies of successful anti-colonialism, and his stride in anti-Zionism presented the Muslim Brotherhood with a kind of a cognitive dissonance. On the one hand, Nasser was like the hero of Arabism, and they liked that, and he kicked the British out, and they liked that, and he dissed the Israelis, and they liked that. At the same time, he wasn't frum by their standards, and they didn't like that, so they didn't know what to do, to cheer him or not to cheer him. And Sadat, when he came to power, also presented something of that, because, you like the guy, the owned the guy, he gave Israel a bloody nose in the Yom Kippur War. You understand? And same was true of Sadat's controversial peace treaty with Israel. Oh, he made peace with the terrible Jews and all the rest of it. But he got all the land back. You understand? This is something Egypt has trouble swallowing today. This secured recovery of all their land in the Sinai. This has been a cognitive dissonant societal sore point in Egypt until today. These, I'm showing you the structural issues that characterize the society of the largest neighbor next door to Israel. The same Sadat, whose friends benefited from the corrupt infantile policy where he replaced the socialism with kleptocracy, that same guy crossed the canal, fought off Israel, and gave the Israeli army a bloody nose, and eventually used diplomacy successfully to kick Israel out of the Sinai. You can't help it. He did succeed in doing that, right? Israel was willing to pay the price, but he did do that. And so that's what I mean when I say they created cognitive dissonance in Egypt. They hate this, but they like this, and they're willing to put up with that. Okay? They say, listen, he won the war, and he did get the land back. They just don't like the fact that Israel has a peace treaty with Israel. Mubarak, who came after Sadat in the 80s, 90s, and the early 21st century, had no charisma at all. He didn't do anything great. So it's just a corrupt regime whose population grew, but the economy did not grow. Now, Israel knows this, but this is beyond their control. To appease the public, Mubarak will maintain a poisonous discourse about Israel while at the same time upholding the peace treaty. So he did a very typical Arab thing. He said one thing here and another thing to this audience. This will not result in the stability that Mubarak seeks. It will valorize the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, and will leave Egypt a potential firecracker on Israel's doorstep, ad hayom hazeh. Israel always has to, you and I can't control this. Nobody can control this. It's an eternal Egyptian business. Every day, Israel says like this, we have enough trouble with Iran. Meanwhile, Egypt, the government is sitting on the Muslim extremists. And they would like, we're very aware that Egypt would like to attack Israel. But we're also aware that the whole circumstance that I just described prevents it for the foreseeable future. That's the best we'll ever get. May this continue on and on and on. Because to get in Egypt, in which they say, Israel's not so bad, maybe we should think of creative relations with them and trade, and they can help us and we can help them. And after all, we all live in the same Middle East. No, none of that. Like I say, just go online and read Al Aram for 2 minutes. Or watch any Egyptian TV show that you can see if you care to on the YouTube. Or any news program if you care to, you can see with subtitles on the internet. And it's poison about Israel. And it's the protocols the elder Zionists times 10. And I'm talking about in the year 2018. So the government will keep the public heated up, will accommodate to these feelings, and everybody gets to damn Israel and the Jews, but meanwhile they don't overthrow the government. Well, as I said before, therefore, the number one pro-Israel factor turns out to be Egypt's lousy economy, which is a Matthias. It's just a fact. Okay? It was not imagined by Sadat back in 1973. He thought that Egypt was on the verge of a golden era. They defeated Israel, eventually get their land back. Egypt will become a new Pharaoh type situation. Everybody will be great, and everything will be good. Well, it didn't happen. But I'm warning you, and I hope I'm wrong, but don't be shocked. Egypt can turn on a dime overnight, right? Don't forget what I just said. Egypt tomorrow could become a nightmare for Israel and for others, right? And so, in other words, we have a treaty there for 40 years, they're close to 40 years, but it doesn't mean it's another 40 years. Doesn't even mean it's another year. You have to basically say, Baruch Hashem Yom Yom, as the expression goes. As for the other Arab states, they can't take on Israel without Egypt, although Assad in Syria, the old man, Hafiz Assad, will dream of doing so, and therefore, in order for him to build up Syria, in order to take on Israel, he will push a population increase. The thing that Egypt is resisting, the government in Syria will push. You can do that through natalist policies. Every baby get $1,000, a present or something like that, or tax breaks and things of that nature. And because his dream is to build Syria up to such a large population, they can go mano a mano with Israel. You understand? And therefore, they went from 7 million to 18, right? Which is almost triple. Okay. Now in Egypt, in Syria, it's a funny story, because the baby boom took down the regime. You understand? Because they have no economy, and you have what's called negative growth, so that led to disturbances. Unlike Egypt, which is a genuine country, and Egypt has a single population of Egyptians. That's all they got over there. Syria is the opposite. I've told you many times, and you know this. Syria is a conglomeration put together by the French and the British after the First World War. You got your Sunnis, you got your Shiites, you got your Alawites, and who the heck knows? They got the Druze, and who knows what else. And each one, by the way, hates the other. And by the way, I don't blame them for hating the other, okay? There's reasons. No, I mean, there's reasons going back in history. You have no idea. Who today remembers the Druze massacres of the Christians in 1861? People don't remember these things. But they do. They know it like you know, the President's Day. And the result, therefore, has been that the expanding population ended up threatening the existence of the regime and indeed of the country. Because you have, just take a look at this. Already in the 80s, the expanding population went against the old man Assad, and he wiped out the city, didn't he, or something? The Hama massacre took place. This is in Syria. Not now, this Assad, the old guy. I'm talking about something happened 30-some years ago. In 82, when the Hafiz Assad Syrian Arab Army and the defense companies, that's their Gestapo, you know, under the orders of the country's president, besieged the town for 27 days in order to quell an uprising by the Muslim brother against the government. The massacre carried out by the army under commanding General Assad's brother effectively ended a campaign begun in 76 by the Sunni groups, including against the government. Whoa! So 3 years or 2 years after Kissinger negotiated the disengagement between the Syrians and the Israelis on the Golan Heights, we didn't notice it at the time. The Muslim Brotherhood declared a civil war against the Assad government. Our news was asleep at the switch. I followed the news at that time, so did you. Who heard about this kind of business? You see? Initial diplomatic reports come to 1,000 were killed, but later on it's 2,000. No, it's 40,000, which means it's 400,000. You know, you're talking about the Arabs over here. Another about 1,000 Syrian soldiers were killed over there. The attackman described single deadliest acts by any Arab government against its own people in the Middle East. This, my friends, was written before the current war. Okay, this description is about 20 years old. And the current war, when the current regime under baby Assad has used the poison gas and things like that, as you know, it's 1 million. And not 40, it's 1 million. That's a conservative estimate. I'm talking about killed. Okay? Let alone the other stuff. And according to, anyway, you get the idea. You don't need to see the rest. I'm simply pointing out that the expanding population and the no jobs and all the rest of it created a lot of disgruntled people who have time with their hands hanging around the street corners in Syrian towns and villages, and all it takes is some clever guy to say, kill. In fact, that's the first thing that comes to your mind. And they do. Okay? They do. That's the difference between a stable country and an unstable country. There are very few stable countries in the world. The United States, so far, has been a stable. You don't know what's tomorrow, but it's a stable country. If somebody stands up in the middle of the street and says, let's burn down the government, people just walk by, and, normally you walk by in the street, there are people like that, okay? In Arab countries, somebody says, burn down the government, immediately 100 people collect, and next thing you know, you got trouble in your hands. This is the difference between a stable and unstable situation. And of course, you don't need me to tell you about let's go to the next one, the current massacres the current massacres in Syria. That's obvious, okay? So the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War did not turn out the way Syria envisioned. Assad. His tight relationship with the USSR would not avail him in recovering the Golan. In retrospect, it was the beginning, the Yom Kippur War, of the USA displacing the Soviets in the Middle East, even though the Soviets would continue to have many friends and bases in there, but the Russians could not deliver Israel. The Russians could not deliver Israel. They had no diplomatic relationship with Israel. And so they're not much use in the bargaining that will take place in the 80s and the 90s and afterwards in the Middle East. On the other hand, over the decades, this is interesting when we look at our perspective, the USA cannot deliver Israel. That's funny, we give them all the money. They will deliver the 1979 peace treaty with Egypt, but that was there are two deals, in other words, looking back in the perspective of 40 years, 45 years, that the U.S. could deliver Israel, and I mean big deals. One was the peace treaty with Egypt, but that was a clear-cut deal with a defined end. They had good lawyers, right? They wrote out in all the details what Egypt owes to Israel, what Egypt owes to Israel, the borders, and all the rest of it. The other deal was not a good deal. I'm talking about from the lawyer point of view. Let's go to the next one. Yeah, that's it. Is that the last one? He says, the other one is open-ended, as you know, the Oslo Treaty, right? It did not talk about the refugee return. It did not talk about Yerushalayim. It did not talk about some. It's just a bad deal. A frustrated Israel will subsequently try for a clear deal, but will not succeed. Remember this at Camp David? Barak was ready to give away the store, including the Kotel. I think many of us remember this. And Arafat, for whatever reason, said no deal. So in other words, you start with what I told you at the beginning of tonight. What if the other side doesn't surrender? What if the other side doesn't offer any negotiations? No clear deal. What do? That's also a negotiating tactic. I don't answer you. You see? We have lawyers here. You know, sometimes if you think that's the best strategy, you just obfuscate, correct? You don't come up with any kind of actual plan. And Israel had not expected this. The non-clear-cut deal, of course, reflects, with the PLO, reflects the fact that none of us like, and that is that the PLO was one of the big winners of the Yom Kippur War. The PLO was one of the big winners of the Yom Kippur War, which is why you reflected when Arafat, as I showed you, showed up in the UN in '74, after all the Arab states came together and said, we recognize the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Then what's Israel supposed to do with that? Israel said, we don't recognize it. I get that. But nevertheless, all of a sudden the ball's in their court. Israel had not expected this when the Yom Kippur War was fought, obviously. But I've told you 1,000 times, one of the basic rules of history is wars produce unexpected results. Right? Do not count on your goals at the end of the war looking like your goals were at the beginning of the war. The failure to either expel the Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza, or else withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza in exchange for a real peace treaty, assuming that one was possible, was and is the supreme security challenge of Israel since 1973. Basically, what is to be done? What is to be done? If you don't kick them out, that's one way. If you pull out, that's another way. If you have something in the middle, so what is it? And you have the Hityashvut, you have the rise of the settlements in Yehuda and Shomron in the West Bank, which is totally understandable. I was there myself. Do you have this? No. Okay. I was going to show you a picture of me and Rabbi Mark were there in Ely a few months ago. It's very nice. But what exactly is the plan? What's the plan? You ask Bibi. In other words, do you want a single state with all the Palestinians and the Jews? And they don't want that. So then, what's the plan? What's the goal? You understand? And nobody has an answer to this, unless you say either this extreme or this extreme. But what's the goal in the middle? If time stood still, that's one thing. But 21st century weapons, it's not 1973 anymore. We're not using the Civil War weapons. The World War II weapons anymore. Plus the reality of Iran, plus the taker of the Gaza Strip following the disengagement, the hit not could, plus the large Muslim population in Europe, plus the flowering of the BDS genre demonization groups, plus a political system in America where the rise of Trump has resulted in the possible alienation of the Democratic Party, all this has vastly complicated Israel's security challenges. Okay? Because for better or worse, Trump has polarized support for Israel. I'm not blaming him or something, because I'm not, but that's the unfortunate reality that we're experiencing at this time. And listen, if Trump is pro-Israel, at least so far, and if Pence wins, so there's your dream scenario. It's Trump, it's Pence, it's Nikki Haley, and the Mashiach, something like that. They're not going to be like that. They're not going to be like that. So then, what's the next administration? You're always one administration from who knows what. Because if others win, that's a different story. Okay. So Israel won the Yom Kippur War, but its security situation did not become less complex. So far, the USA has struck with Israel, which is not what people would have predicted in 1973. That's 45 years of the USA backing and funding Israel, military and civilian economy, despite strains. Let's get this straight. The U.S. especially, I didn't go into it this year, I hope to next time, and when they did the 75 disengagement, they did a cornucopia, as they call it. Basically, they said, I guess, we'll give the Army whatever they need. And that was the first time it happened under Ford. And after that, the USA, the people active with AIPAC may be familiar with this. The U.S. has given Israel unbelievable amount of stuff, military hardware, since the 70s, through the 80s, through the 90s, through the early days, through Obama. Okay, let's be clear about this. They gave him a ton of military stuff. Now, that's half the story. Now I'm going to tell you the other half of the story. Starting with Nixon. That's right, Nixon, after the Yom Kippur War, right after the Yom Kippur War, they gave $400 million in military aid. Eventually became $4 or $5 billion. And it's been in the area of $4 or $5 billion. If you include side deals and things of that nature, you know, you have to study the budgetary process very closely if you're that sort. And they've been pouring billions into Israel's civilian economy for close to half a century. Nobody predicted this. If you would have told somebody back in the 70s, they said, well, it's got another 2-3 years, another 4 or 5 years. So thank God it happened like that. But I'm just telling you, one of the results of the Yom Kippur War was that Israel and America became joined at the hip. Okay? And in a way that hadn't been true beforehand. And basically, it's good, but let's put it this way. I'm underwater, and you have the snorkel, you know what I mean? And you're holding it up the way. I can't survive without you holding the air coming in. It's not a healthy situation. We have no choice, but it's not a healthy situation. Israel has lived in Baruch Hashem, they did it, but it's a very unhealthy situation for a country where you're totally dependent on another one. And it's in spite of strains. You've had the Jimmy Carter and Begin, and then recently Obama and Bibi. It's very interesting. In spite of all that, it's the billions and billions and billions. It's quite remarkable. But the perspective of half century, the question to raise tonight is, can we look forward to another 45 years of American support of Israel? That's a difficult question to ask. No, it's not. It's an easy question to ask. It's a difficult question to answer. Right? One of the very interesting fact that has emerged very clearly in the last decade is the Arab fears of Iran. Because the Iranians, if you know who they are, cannot help but try to recreate the empire of Cyrus. That's who they are. Many in the West don't understand this, but you don't have to be a big genius, not that smart, to understand ABCs. They are an imperial race. That's how they view themselves. And once upon a time, they ruled Sheva v'Yasrim, Me'yom Medina, Me'hodev v'Akush. They really did. And long ago, they organized it well. Okay, I mean, in their day, in their 5 minutes of history, they were impressive. Just to give you one datum, I always remember, the post office was faster from Shushan to Constantinople, where it is today, than it was in subsequent centuries, 11 days. So they had an efficient empire. And then evil people took it away from us, but we're going to get it back. I told you before, the Khomeini Revolution and those guys have an agenda. And there's 10 or 20 items on the agenda. At the top of the agenda is what I just told you. Israel's a little lower. At the top of the agenda is to make Iran what it's supposed to be. Or to paraphrase Donald Trump, make Iran great again. Okay? It's no joke to them. And by the way, Iran is an ancient and very impressive civilization with a very deep and impressive culture. It is in literature and art and poetry and cuisine and 100 other forms. They are a very impressive group. And when they look at the map, you're just Americans. It's just another country. They say this map is wrong. There shouldn't be Pakistan. Pakistan should be part of Iran. There shouldn't be Turkestan and Shmurkestan and Klekistan. It all used to be once upon a time part of Iran. There shouldn't be Turkey. And there shouldn't be Israel and Egypt. It used to be part of Iran. You get it? That's how it goes. They actually want to expand it beyond that because, by the way, the Arabs know this. They're not stupid. You have to add to what I just told you the fact that since the 1500s, Iran has gone Shiite, and the Shiites therefore dream of adding Saudi Arabia to the empire, which they didn't have long ago, because that's Mecca, Medina. And the world has been wrong that the Sunnis, who are the wrong kind of Islam, has been controlling the holy places of Islam. And the way they see it, just imagine the caliphate plus, in other words, a giant mass of territory from the borders of India, maybe including a big chalik of India, Kashmir and so forth, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And then they're ready to rock, baby. Then they're ready to take on China and Russia and America. And that's how they see the world. And you can say, what's he talking about, all the rest of it? But I'm laughing if you don't realize, because what I'm telling you is ABC. Okay? And to them, the elimination of Israel is important but it's not at the top of the charts. What I just described to you is at the top of the charts, and the Arabs therefore know that the stronger Iran gets, it can't help itself. It's intrinsic to the nature of the Iranian thinking of the power group that's in there since 1979. Even the Shah, in his wild dreams, thought like that, but he knew it's not for his time. But that's who they are, and just get used to it. And they're going to take on Russia one day in their mind, you see, and beat them. And America's a temporary phenomenon. It's a bunch of different races come together in a unstable way, and they'll tear each other apart. I mean, this is how they write in their books. This is how they write in their discourse. And therefore, the Arabs are scared to death because they are the meat. And that explains what's happening currently in the Middle East, because there's an objective need for a Sunni counterweight. But what's really funny, I don't have the maps because the power outage took away the rest of oh, you do have it. Go for that. Okay. This is the Shiite dream of taking these guys on. Do you have the next map? By any chance? This is the empire of the old days. By the way, this is Cyrus. One king later, they got Egypt too, in Cambyses. Let's go to the next map, if you have one. That's it? Okay. No, what I was going to tell you is, good. He says, this is the next war, because at the same time, Erdogan had been going crazy to revive Suleiman the Magnificent. You understand? He wants to revive the Ottomans. Now, the Turks don't think that way. He does. So that's the difference. By the Iranians, it's the whole group. In Turkey, it's a group, certain group. But the group in power right now wants to reconquer the Ottoman Empire. And so look at this. He wants to be him again. So let's go to the previous map. There's your battle, right? Boom, boom. Who's going to win? Now, if you're Israel, you say like this: just keep me out of this. Right? Tell me when it's over. If only life was so simple. If the good Lord has a weird sense of humor, you're gonna see this in a while. Now, of course, they're very far from the Turkey countries, very far from recreating this. Or am I wrong? They are hoping that all the Muslims that are moving into Europe will support Turkey. He says so. If you read the Turkish press, he says so. He says all these guys in Austria and in Germany and all the rest of it are really on our side. He was angry at a Dutch politician last year, if you remember, for suggesting that they should be loyal to Holland, if you're living in Holland. No, they're Turks. Why Turks? Because the Turks were the Sunni champions, and they did what the other Sunnis couldn't do, which was conquer a third of Europe. Look at this. Look how far they got. This is Budapest, baby. Okay, this is Hungary. And the sky's the limit, right? Now, the worst possible scenario, which won't happen, is if A joined with B. But since the Sunnis and the Shiites hate each other, I'm not even going to think about that. All I know is that if you're Bibi, you simply say like this: just wake me up when this is over. All Israel wants to do, Chavia Kiavor Hazam, as the pasuk says in Yeshayahu. Just hide low, Bo b'chaderecha b'chavi ad Kiavor Hazam. Just be in the like Dorothy in the what do you call it, in the storm. As I mentioned in previous years in my concluding lectures, these last 4 years or so, the joker in the deck is still the Kurds. We're still unliberated. They're just messed over, right? Shafted by everybody. If a Kurdistan arose, it'd be a game changer, but they're landlocked. So if you ever got this, that would wreck up the Iran and the Turkey business. You see what I'm saying? On the other hand, how could Israel get to them? There's no ocean or sea area. Now maybe in the modern times you can. This is what Israel's dreaming for. You know, I told you what the Turks are dreaming about. You saw that map. I told you what the Persians are dreaming about. You saw that map. What is Israel dreaming about? Bibi is not thinking of recreating the empire of King David and Joab. We don't need that. Let's leave us alone. He's dreaming maybe the Kurds will somehow or other emerge and rip whole Khalakim away from Turkey and from Iran. And even though it seems like Iran would still be big, but you have the next map? You able to do that? You go to, yeah. No. He said, well, let me put it this way. Iran has a lot of fissures. If you looked at an ethnic map of Iran, it's not all Persians at all. And so there you go. If the Kurds broke away, then this and this and this would start to break away also, and the country would tear apart. That's really Bibi's dream. Oh, well, let me put it this way. What other possible dream is there? You can't conquer and occupy. Right? You know, what is the dream? The dream is they'll disintegrate. You understand? Into constituent parts. Don't be fooled by everybody in Iran is Iranian. They're not. You understand? And so they have their big problems. These are the realities of the Middle East. Let us leave this sober subject to talk about perhaps my last item for tonight, which is an even more sober subject, the Jewish condition in the diaspora the last 45 years. I just wrote this before I came here tonight. Since Yom Kippur War till today, the big story here in perspective is one of failure. Because the non-Orthodox is the Rov Minyan, and Rov Minyan is the great majority of the Jewish people all over the place, of world Jewry. They failed in the 1970s and afterwards to come up with a way to prevent serious intermarriage in order to ensure Jewish survival. Forget the Orthodox. I'm talking about the broad mass of the Jews. They have one agenda, so to speak, if you want to call it that, and that is keep the thing going, keep the business going. And have been doing a job. Unlike the Orthodox, they didn't have a fundamentalist and a culturally insular mindset as models. I get that. On the contrary, they opposed such models in principle, which makes sense to me from a modernist point of view. If you live in the 20th century, if you live in the 21st century, okay, so have it be that way. But if that's the case, if you're committed to Jewish survival in a modern world and being part of that world, and if you have so much money out there they can set up smart think tanks, why didn't you? Okay? Because if they haven't come up with a solution to this problem, how to keep the Jews Jewish, not the from ones, how to keep the Jews Jewish, then that's your job that you failed. Why don't you set up effective mechanisms to think up in the box or think out of the box of ways of keeping the masses of Jewish youth in the mishpacha? The only halfway decent idea I can think of in the last 40 years is the birthright. And that's only a little, it's so-so. You know, Michael Steiner, who I know, you know, in other words, that's an idea, but it's a small piece. You understand? It's been so-so. I'm sure I told you this story. I'll repeat it again. My wife we went on a flight back from Israel, and because it sticks with me, you know. And Karen, she's got a bigger mouth than me, so she asked the guy on the birthright. They're coming back from Stony Brook. Nice kids. And the bottom line was, he says, how do you like the trip? Oh, I liked it very much. Has this changed your perspective of Judaism? He so profoundly, yeah, nice young guy. How so? For the first time in my life, I'm going to give serious consideration to dating a Jewish girl. Right? Which is huge in its way, but you see what I'm saying when it's a so-so, okay? As a result, although we don't like to think about it, the years since the Yom Kippur War have seen a serious diminution in the Jewish population around the world, particularly in the West, and we are all weaker as a result. Okay? The Jewish population ought to be a lot bigger than it is today. And same thing particularly with the fertility. It's not just a question of the of marriage and intermarriage and marrying out, and therefore not being part of Judaism. Now, I'm not talking about the cases in which they married someone out and then, conservative reform, whatever you want to call it, and then the partner wants to be Jewish and participate in Jewish. That's rare. The case is usually the other way around. And same thing with fertility, where as part of the modern ethos, you don't want to have children. If you do want to have children, it's a very small number. That's just the way it goes. Now, I'm not talking about an Orthodox thing over here. I'm talking about a broad Jewish one. The best minds in the non-frum Jewish world either failed to grapple with this in a serious way, or else they gave up decades ago. Either way, it's an indictment. I'm telling you something that's not in the history books now, but will be one day, if there are any Jews left to write about it. In a perspective, I predict in 50 years or so, when the people start writing about the ancient 20th century, they'll say, I don't know why. You had such a large diaspora with a lot of smart people in there, and they come up with, with any system or any way to make the young people living on their own in a voluntary, multicultural, pluralistic society choose to be Jewish. Is there any hope in the future for a turnaround among this population? That's the question. Viewed with the perspective of nearly half a century, is this not the most among the most significant developments in modern Jewish history? Is this not a powerful indictment of the Jewish establishment? Can a group of people that have produced the geniuses who have created the internet not created a path for someone to be modern, secular, immersed in the culture of the West, and Jewish to the point where they care enough about Jewish survival to want to marry a Jew and raise a Jewish family? These are disturbing questions. To dumb this down in Baltimore terms, forget whether the JCC should be open on Shabbos. Why can't the JCC do a better job if their definition is promoting in marriage? They don't count that anymore as a goal because it's not a realizable goal. That's just one tiny datum of a large picture. These are uncomfortable questions, are they not? Uncomfortable questions are, to my mind, the best because they force us to think. Here is, my friends, something to think about. And with that I say, it's been fun, but we are adjourned, sine die. Good night.